Greetings, everyone. My name is Tanya Moran Adolph. I'm Associate Director of Generational Programs at the USC Alumni Association. Welcome to the role of women, race, and politics in the 2020 elections. Before we get started today, we have just a couple of housekeeping items. First off, your session is being recorded, so if you haven't already, please hit continue. Your video and audio have been turned off, but please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions, and feel free to type them out as we're going along, and we'll be sure to address them at the very end of the program. I'd now like to introduce Jamila Nuruddin, Vice Chair of Programming for the USC Trojan Women's Network, to begin today's program.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Hello and welcome, everyone. I am Jamila Nuruddin, and I'm a graduate in class of 2006 from the School of Theater, now the School of Dramatic Arts. And I'm very excited about the conversation we're having today. The recent 2020 election has been one of the most contentious in recent memory. And with over 150 million Americans turning out to vote, which was the highest turnout in over a century, this country has had some very powerful shifts and introspection going on around race, gender, and what that really means for this past election. So what we're going to actually do today is we have a very wonderful guest, Dr. Phillips, who's the assistant professor at the political science at USC, Dorn's life, and an expert on the intersection of race, gender, immigration, and American politics. And she'll share her insight on what happened in this election, why it happened, and most importantly, where we're going to be going. So following Dr. Phillips's presentation, we'll actually welcome on the double Trojan alumni, Paola Fernandez of the Latinas Lead California organization. And at the conclusion of their discussion, we'll open it up for Q&A. So feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A box as we move through this very illuminating conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Phillips.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jamila, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be with you today and to have a conversation about an exciting election that I know we're all still thinking a lot about and trying to understand, as well as what's to come, and trying to understand what the election really shows us about what we can expect for the future. And right now, I'm going to give you a very, very quick summary of some of the things that have happened in the election that I think are worth paying attention to, not only for understanding where we've been, but also for understanding where we might be headed in the next few years in American politics and in our daily lives as people who live in the United States. So I'm going to do a very quick look at gender and race in the 2020 election by talking about three things. First, I'm going to actually show you some recent history and show you some of the patterns of race and gender representation in who gets elected in state legislatures, and I'll tell you why. And I'm going to show you a little, just a brief picture of who's been getting elected for the past 2 decades across the United States. And then I'm going to talk about who has run and who has been winning in this past election in the House. So we're going to move from state legislatures to the US Congress and talk about some really exciting and interesting trends in terms of women's representation in the US House that happened in this election. And then we're going to move finally to talking about the presidency and how women voters expressed their preferences, who showed up and who they showed up for in this recent election. And what I wanted to do by looking at states and the Congress and the presidency, and also looking at candidates, elected officials, and voters, is really to illustrate that women from all different groups are playing a lot of dynamic and really important roles in American politics. And I think that has only been increasing in terms of its visibility over the past few years, right? Now, this year we had a lot of discussion, for instance, about landmark years, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, right? And all of the progress that women have made at different times in American history. And I think one of the things that is really interesting to me as a scholar of race and gender and politics is that every election, we seem to have an election where people talk about, this is a landmark election for women. This is a landmark election for women. And, you know, it's one of the things you have to ask is, well, what are we changing the landmarks? Are we having bigger goals? Are we having bigger expectations for women's representation and women's voices in our democracy? So those are some of the questions that are on my mind as I think about this election. So I'll start with showing you a picture of who has won in state legislatures. Now, state legislatures aren't something we talk about a lot on the national news, but every year, at any given moment, there are about 7,500 state legislative seats in the United States. And they have an incredible amount of power, especially when Congress is really logjammed and not able to make a lot of legislative work happen. A lot of really important policymaking happens in the states. And what this graph is showing you is over time, what percentage of all of those seats are being won by members of different groups, right? So in every 2 years, right? So if you look at the red line across the top, that shows you that in any given year, pretty much between the late 90s and and 2015, white men tend to win about 2/3 of all state legislative elections, right? That's across the country. And then if you drop down to the pink line below that, you'll see that white women tend to win about 20 to 22% of all state legislative elections. And then when you drop down to the lines at the very bottom, right? Those are all of the other groups that I tend to study: African American women and men, Latinas and Latinos, and Asian American women and men. And what that means is that combined, right, white women and men are having a very different experience in terms of winning elections in state legislatures than people from other racial groups. But there's also an interesting dynamic happening here that I want to pay close attention to. And part of the reason why I think it's important to talk about race and gender at the same time when we talk about who has a voice in American democracy. Because the other pattern that's really clear when we zoom in just on those bottom lines in the graph and look at the groups who are winning less than 5% of the time each, what we can see is that consistently, men's electoral success outpaces women's across groups. Now, the reasons for that are really different across racial groups. And the availability of opportunities to run in viable races is very different across racial groups and across gender groups as well. But I wanted to show you this history to give you a sense of a very long and persistent pattern in the United States in terms of representation, because these patterns also translate up to the federal level in terms of Congress, right? So we see lots and lots of really consistent representation, most of the representation going to white men, right? And then white women really not being able to go past really a quarter of seats, and then less than 10% of seats really being up for grabs and really contested by people of color, men and women both. And one of the things that I look at a lot in my research is, why are these patterns so persistent, right? If you look at that graph that I just showed you, these are fairly straight lines over time. And we have data from the last few years that extends the analysis that I showed you. And we show that these things, while there has been some exciting movement, things are not moving very much in terms of bending those lines. And so one of the things that I think about a lot is, what are the realistic opportunities out there for people who want to run and win, right? There are lots of ways to be a leader in your community. And one of the things we are trying to understand in political science is, how are opportunities different for people from different groups, okay? Are there electoral opportunities that are more readily available for white men than there are for Latinas, for instance, right? And we can talk about that more in the Q&A. I have a book coming out next year about this very question in terms of where women can run and where opportunities for realistic chances at winning are in terms of running for office. The other big part of the equation is that what we know is that when women get on the ballot, they win just as often as men. They have to work harder, raise more money from more people, do a lot more fundraising from smaller donors, all of those things, right? It's harder, but they do it, right? And women win as often as men. So they're very high quality candidates. Where we start to run into obstacles to representation is in getting people on the ballot, right? So there aren't enough women across racial groups running for office. And so the next set of slides I'm going to show you looks at what the dynamics were in House races in this last election in terms of people getting on the ballot, because this is where I think things are starting to get much more interesting and I think much more promising for the future. So in terms of gender parity or gender representation, right, more women ran in 2020 than in previous years, right? So if you look at this slide, what you'll see is the purple bars will show you how many women ran in 2020. And let me just make sure I'm looking at the right thing. So, and what you'll see is that there is this increase over previous years. Now, what's really interesting here is in recent elections, a lot of those increases have been driven by more Democratic women running, right? There's actually a long conversation in political science about why there might be more opportunities for women to run in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party. And we can talk about whether that may be shifting. Because here's what's happening that's really interesting in terms of who's running, right? More women ran as Republicans than ever before for the House. And that's, you know, if you look at the top part of this graph, it shows you how many women filed. That's people who got into the primary. And then nominees, the bars that are under the nominees category shows you who actually went to the general election as the Republican nominee or the Democratic nominee for Congress for a particular seat. And what you can see is that on one side of the screen, I have the numbers for Democrats, right? And there really wasn't much change in terms of the numbers of women running as Democrats for the House. On the Republican side, however, there has been incredible growth, right? And that growth is not something that just fell out of the sky. And we can talk about what some of the reasons might be. I think people are still trying to figure out some of it, but I certainly have some theories, and I'm really interested to hear what other people think. But what we know is that Republican women have started running in this last election. There was a big jump in terms of Republican women starting to run for the House. And I think what's really interesting is the next question to ask is, so more women were running, did they win, right? How did that work out? So I think one of the takeaways, if we just start by looking at Democrats, right, is that we know that there were higher rates of success for Democratic women nominees than there were for Republican women nominees. So these are people who got through the primary, were on the general election ballot as either the Democrat or the Republican nominee. More Democratic women won after that. Higher percentage, sorry. There was a higher total number of Democratic women who won, and their success rate was higher in terms of how many nominees went on to actually win. But Republican women were starting from a pretty significant number, right? In terms of 13 people being in the House previously and getting to 28, right? They doubled the number of women in their party in the House from the last session. And that's pretty remarkable. One of the things I'll also point out is that the distribution in terms of women of color across these two parties is, as you might guess, if you pay attention to American politics very much, the distribution of women of color is much more lopsided towards Democratic nominees than Republican nominees, right? But there was a significant amount of growth, I would say an appreciable amount of growth, in terms of the women of color in the Republican Party who were actually able to win their elections. But much of the growth in terms of women in Congress on the Democratic side is being driven by more and more women of color getting nominated and winning. So these are all things I'd be happy to talk about more in the Q&A. So if you have questions about it, send them my way about what's happening or what we expect to see next. So then let's turn and look specifically at what's happening with the newest people in Congress, right? So now we're looking just at non-incumbent women who won seats. This is people who were not already in office, just people who were challenged or who were new or running in open seats. And so what's really interesting here is that there are more new Republican women than Democratic women in the House this year who are going to be entering in 2020. And if you look at where the yellow arrows are, there are equal numbers of new women of color from both parties. And I think that that is a conversation worth having in terms of both parties and how they are supporting women, how they are recruiting women, and sort of which women have a place and which women are getting the support in both parties. I think that some people were really surprised to learn that women of color didn't make up a larger number of the new women for Democrats in the House. And at the same time, people were really, I think, kind of surprised that there were 4 new Republican women of color as well. So the different parties have different pasts and different bases that they appeal to. And so I think these are some really interesting new data that show that the parties may be starting to move in different directions in terms of where women fit in and how women are shaping the agenda. Okay, so now I've talked about people getting elected, people running for office. Now let's talk about voters, right? So I only have one slide on voters because I think there's a lot to sort of figure out. And I think there's really one big story in terms of women and men and voting in this election. And that is that the gender gap, the argument that I have been making for a long time and several of my colleagues have been making is that when we talk about a gender gap, we're really obscuring a major difference, right, amongst women, which is that the gender gap is really a race gender gap. If you look at this really simple table, I pulled some data from the Latino Decisions survey firm. They specialize in really high quality surveying of all voters, but they have really special techniques they've developed in terms of getting high quality survey data for African American, Latino, Native, and Asian American voters, as well as white voters. And what their data show corroborates what a lot of other polls have been showing, which is that white women voted in the majority for Trump, right? And white women have voted in the majority for the Republican Party for decades in all but 2 elections. I think since we've been keeping track, which starts in the late 50s. In all but 2 elections, white women voted in the majority for the Republican Party. So in some ways, this is not a new result. I think that a lot of folks were trying to figure out whether this might be the year where that shifted a bit due to what I would call the unique candidacy of the incumbent, but it didn't happen, right? At the same time, women of color continued to really push their support towards the Democratic candidate, as they have in every election previous. And so there's an interesting dynamic happening here where I think there's a lot of questions to ask in terms of whether we can really talk about this thing called a gender gap, right? When really there seems to be a clear racial divide within the gender gap. And one of the things I think we need to talk about is how moving forward as voters and as women, right, we think about what are the connections and coalitions that can be made, and in terms of what does it mean to when we talk about what women want out of their elected officials and what women's priorities are. I think it's really important to ask the question, which women? Because women have incredibly diverse experiences in the United States, and I think it's valuable to really try to bring out all of those voices in a democratic process. And the more we talk about a gender gap, the more we kind of obscure a lot of those important differences and the richness of our experiences as women in this country. So I'm going to actually leave it there. I'm going to say that and then leave it there. I hope I've given you some data to think about, maybe ask some questions about, because what I'd really like to do now is turn it over to our other guest, Paola Fernandez, and hear about some of the work that she's been doing. So thank you, and I hope there's some interesting information in there. I will stop sharing my screen. And welcome, Paola.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Phillips. I, for one, really want to read your book, so I'm really excited for when you get to publish that. So hi, everyone. As Dr. Phillips mentioned, my name is Paola Fernandez. I am part of Latinas Lead California Young Professionals Network, and I currently serve as Director of Engagement for our Young Professionals Network. I am really happy to be here today among all of you, fellow Trojans. I am a double Trojan. I graduated from USC Dornsife with a BA in International Relations in 2014, and then most recently from USC Price with a Master's in Public Policy in 2019. So I'm really happy to be here. And I think Dr. Phillips's data is really important in kind of digesting what's been happening over the past year and during the presidential election as well as local elections. My work primarily with Latinas Lead California is based in California. We work to elect Latinas to public office. But before I get into that, I kind of wanted to provide just some anecdotes to complement Dr. Phillips's data, and they're personal anecdotes, kind of to elaborate on what motivates women to get involved in politics and the reasons behind that. And I think that's really important to ground us in understanding why people become civically engaged and why they don't become civically engaged. So my journey in civic engagement and politics really began in 2015. I had just started my first job as a city hall staffer, and something that didn't sit well with me is that I noticed that at the time there was only one council member who was a woman on the 15-seat council. At the time, it was Council President Ray Martinez, and that just baffled me. I didn't understand how that could be possible. Someone who personally values women's leadership and is all about creating those pipelines to gender equity and gender parity in these elected positions. Didn't sit well with me. Luckily, though, if you do follow LA politics, we have 3 council members who are now women, Council Member Monica Rodriguez and new council member Rahman. So really excited about that. But going back to just feeling kind of frustrated with this, through networking and then finding a fellow alumni, ended up finding Latinas Lead California, and they had just started the YPN. So Latinas Lead California was founded about 2 decades ago. We are the first, California's first political action committee that is solely dedicated to electing Latinas to public office and supporting Latinas running for office. So we do that by fundraising as well as volunteering on campaigns. So our founder, who's actually Councilwoman Monica Rodriguez, and her campaign was the first campaign that I actually had the privilege of working on and volunteering for. She started our organization because she saw this gap and this political environment that wasn't welcoming towards women or Latinas. It was really dominated by male leaders and supporters that really favored men in politics. So in an effort to kind of contrast that environment, she began this. And so it's grown significantly since then. Just this last election, we were able to endorse about 71 candidates, which is amazing. And from the 71 candidates, close to 40 won their races. So we're extraordinarily proud of them. And they were just incredible women. And most of them were first-time candidates, new to politics. And that includes one of our very own YPN members, Danielle Guillen, who is also a USC Price alum. She ran for office, and we're so incredibly proud of her. There were women who were incumbents that ran again, and women who had ran and didn't win the first time and decided to run again and keep going for it. But all these women, they broke glass ceilings in their families, in their communities, and they really gave us all that motivation and are examples of what women can accomplish if we rally behind each other. So we're really proud of those, we're really proud of our candidates. And I think Dr. Phillips talks about what might be the barriers or how women are involved and what kind of produces that involvement. We think that funding is a huge issue when it comes to women deciding to run for office. It's no secret that Latinas, we make 55 cents for every dollar that a white male non-Hispanic person makes, right? So we're already at an economic disadvantage. So Latinas Lead, we fundraise for our candidates. We put our money behind women that we believe in that will rally for us and be our champions in elected office. So these funds really go towards staffing, data, as well as mailers, and we hugely support our candidates through that. And I think that's something we also want to be really cognizant of is building the next generation of women who will be running for office or, again, supporting others. The Young Professionals Network, we are really dedicated to making sure that we provide a space where women can discuss and organize our friends, our family members to to support women who are running and to encourage women to run. I think it's all about kind of creating that base for additional kind of interaction and civic engagement. Many of our members are actually not really involved in politics in the sense that that's not their day job. We are volunteers that work together to support our candidates. So I think I'll leave it at that. Dr. Phillips, if we want to expand, I'm happy to. But yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paola. I think the work that Latinas Lead is doing is really incredible and really gets to what we know is really one of the key challenges, right? Is how do you turn people who are activists in their own community who do other things? You know, one of the things in my book that I found is that, for instance, Latinas and Asian American women who I really focus on are really active in their communities, involved in all sorts of civic organizations, but are not necessarily encouraged to run for office. When people see them being leaders in these settings, they don't walk up to them and say, you know what, you should really run for city council. Whereas men who are in similar situations often have that nod given to them and that psychological drumbeat their entire lives, right, where they're hearing it. And then, in terms of actually getting asked to run for a specific seat by the powerful people in your party, in your local area or in your state, that those powerful people actually do have a harder time actually seeing the leadership potential of women across racial groups in different ways. That's something that I think Latinas Lead really helps to focus on by giving first-time candidates that extra visibility and that extra boost. So one thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of Latinas Lead is this focus on building the next generation, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think one of the things that I've found in my work, in my previous life, I worked in politics, but also in my research, is that, I did an interview once with somebody who said, the issue is that men have been training their successors for years and decades, right? And women, we are showing up and we've only got ourselves. We haven't been training 5 people to come behind us. And when you talked about Latinas Lead wanting to build the next generation, what are some of the things that the organization does to really make sure that they're not only advancing the candidates who are here now, right, but also so that those candidates are bringing folks behind them?
Absolutely. I think that's probably at the forefront of even the discussion of who we endorse. Mm-hmm. For us, that's part of our endorsement process. We do make it a point to ask our candidates, what are they doing for the next generation? What do they envision their roles to be in producing that pipeline? So that's just something that we make very apparent when endorsing our candidates. But also as the Young Professionals Network, I think it's all about encouraging each other to organize ourselves. There's so much power in putting your money behind a candidate as a young professional where, you're trying to pay your bills, your student loans. And so when you place money and funds behind a candidate like that, you're rooting for them 100%. So I think that we are encouraging members to run for office at one point if that's what they want to do, and to continue to support and then bring in people that they might know who aren't sure how to participate politically and in the political process. So that's what we're doing. We are encouraging each other, building a space where we can feel free and motivated and encouraged to either run, support, and just build a larger community.
I think that's really interesting how you talk about, fundraising. It's actually a two-way process, right? So there's the effect that it has on you as a donor when you put your money down. And maybe you're paying your loans. I'm sure nobody from USC has loans that you're paying off as alumni, right? But you have all these bills and you choose to set aside money to say, I believe in you and I want to support you. And I think that does do something psychologically to you as a person engaged in politics. But then we also think about what it does for the candidate, right? And I was wondering what some of your experiences are in terms of how does the funding and the fundraising that Latinas Lead supports, what does that do for candidates? Is it about sort of getting people to take them more seriously? Is it about just literally getting bodies in the room to help produce things for them? Like how does it make a difference sort of in their candidacies?
Well, I know you mentioned this part of your data too. Women of color, usually grassroots campaigns, they're getting donations from a variety of donors, and sometimes those donations are small. So any amount is obviously welcome for a lot of our candidates, but it's providing them with the opportunity to get their name out there, to provide visibility in their community. So a lot of our candidates, especially during this pandemic, there was very little physical contact with constituents, right? Just not, it's out of the question at that point. So it was just about getting data, pulling data, getting information about constituents. Mailers were a huge part of what funds were used for. Also more visibility, everyone's checking their mail. Snail mail. So I think that's where it kind of comes down to, is the visibility, getting their names out there, making sure that they have the data to make calls and follow up. Volunteers, they're angels in these campaigns, right? They're not paid. Sometimes there's paid staff, sometimes there's paid political advisors, but usually those funds are really dedicated to providing visibility to the candidate through just communications. So that's where a lot of the funding goes to for these candidates.
That's great. And it seems like it would be especially important given the pandemic and sort of the restraints that put on people's ability to campaign in ways that they normally might. So I'm going to ask Paola one more question, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask either of us, please feel free to send those along in the chat. And the next question I wanted to ask you, Paola, is about what you saw in terms of the ways that candidates were responding to some of the restrictions on their ability to campaign during the coronavirus. And I think specifically about some of the campaigns of women of color that I've been able to watch and be part of in the past, where so much of it is based on your comadre network, all the women that you go to church with, all of you being able to get together and then really like spread out in your own communities and in our own communities. To me, that's one of the reasons that I study women of color, is I find their candidacies are not just moments to build the political power of one woman, right? They tend to build the political power and capacity of all the women around them. And with the coronavirus and, really restricting people's ability to go door to door and go face to face, I was wondering if there were any candidates or any campaigns that you have examples from where you really saw people shifting gears in a way in terms of how they reach out to their communities and really start to and get people to know them.
Absolutely. I think that especially during the pandemic, our networks became less physical and more like virtual. So there were a lot of communications via social media. I mean, I know Latinas Lead, we posted, I think, every single endorsed candidate, there's a picture of them on our social media page. That allowed us to get their names out there and provide more opportunities for visibility. As far as the Comadre network that you're talking about, I mean, that's exactly what it is. My dear friend Danielle, we fundraised for her through Latinas Lead, and then we were able to fundraise for her within our friend group. Like, that is very powerful. And I think that when it comes to this, like, it's about just reaching out to whomever you think can participate. And even just giving people opportunity to say yes or no is also just really powerful. Like, you thought, like, if someone were to think of you as wanting to be politically engaged, like, that's going to do something for you maybe the next time around. So yeah, our network it's definitely broadened. It's more virtual, but I think that's also allowed us to be more timely and seek funding and organizing faster in ways that we probably wouldn't be able to do during like normal times. So that's something that I think we are really excited about, and that Comadre network really is true and really powerful thing. So.
Yeah, and I guess the follow-up question I have to that is, because you personally tend to work with people who are in their 20s and 30s, is is making a donation or volunteering with Latinas Lead, is that the first time people are really doing something explicitly in politics? A lot of the time, is it their first donation ever? Is it their first time making calls?
Sometimes it is. Some of the feedback we've received is that a lot of women didn't know how to get involved. They're like, I think I mentioned this, they're not doing politics on their day-to-day, their 9-to-5 jobs. So it's like,
Yeah.
how do you get involved? And I think we provide that space where you don't have to be working for an elected official to be in politics. You don't have to be working on policy every day to be involved in politics. I think it's just a matter of having someone pull you in. And I think that's where our roles are especially in the YPN. We're pulling people in. We want people to be engaged, and we're encouraging our friends to get involved. And sometimes it's multiple. Sometimes it takes years to get people going, but I think moments like this historical election, it's really fired people up. And hopefully that kind of momentum continues, and we can see that trickle down to our local elections. And yeah, hopefully that continues on. So
great. Thank you so much, Paola. Well, I have lots of other questions I could ask you about what's going on with your work. And I don't know if, am I going off of, I don't know if Tanya or somebody else?
I'm right here, Dr. Phillips. Hi.
Hi.
Awesome program. Thank you. That was so interesting. I can go ahead and read off these questions for you as we move along. Starting off, we have a question from Stephen. Paola, what advice would you give a young aspiring Latina who is interested in running for office one day?
Thank you for that question, Stephen. I think it's really about finding a group of women that you can rely on for that continued support. I think finding friends that might be thinking about it as well, or finding organizations that you think might have resources for women running for office. There are tons of programs out there and training programs. I participated in one out of American University out here in DC that are training women to run for office one day or become involved in politics. It's not always just about running, but there's a lot of resources out there. And I think it's just about asking questions, reaching out, slide into someone's DMs who's involved in this kind of work. So I think it's just about reaching out, being bold, and eventually creating a plan for yourself as well. I think it takes time to build a network. It takes time to build the courage. But if you surround yourself in the right environment and the right people, I think it's possible. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Paola. Kind of building on that, I have another question here. You know, we've seen a lot of women's movements in the past few years, Me Too movement, a lot of the women's marches. How do you think those events have affected women in politics and the way people look at women in politics? And that's to both of you.
I can start. This is something I talk about a lot in my undergraduate teaching in particular, right? Because one of the things we're trying to figure out is all of this energy that we've seen women direct into the Me Too movement and into the women's marches, right? And into involvement, frankly, in issues like Black Lives Matter and issues around police and criminal justice. You know, there are women at the forefront of all of these movements. I would argue that all of these are women's movements. And, you know, how does that energy get translated into political leadership, into elections, right? Into what we sort of how we think about power conventionally in the United States. And I think and also how are people interpreting that, right? How is it sort of informing what people think? I think on the one hand, something that I've been saying for a long time is that women didn't just get pissed 4 years ago. They didn't. Lots of women have been very angry about a lot of things for a long time, right? But I think that what has happened is that in the last couple of years, there has been so much public mobilization about the issues that different groups of women care about, that anger can't be ignored, right? And the potential for those women to be leaders and to be taken seriously by parties and donors and fundraisers and organizations, those are the people that need to take women seriously for them to be able to run. I think the movements that women have been leading have had so much public visibility that now all of those folks with power, frankly, in electoral politics now see women as much more credible candidates and women who are leading on those issues than they might have, I would argue, even 2 or 3 election cycles ago, right? So I think that, social movements and electoral politics absolutely can work hand in hand in terms of changing who we think is legitimate as a leader, but also what issues we think are on the table in terms of reaching out to voters. And, I think that that also has worked in different ways across different groups of women, and I think across the parties in different ways. But I think it certainly has raised the idea that, women are leaders in these movements, and women have leadership capabilities that have not been fully taken advantage of yet, and that they need to be given spaces and given opportunities to really bring that stuff to the rest of the country. I don't know if Paola, you had something else on that.
No, I think that is absolutely, I don't have much else to add except that these movements trickle down to our local elections. I think that's something that a lot of people kind of ignore sometimes. Local elections are so vital. Who represents you on the city council is so essential to your way of life and the quality of life. So I think that even these broad national movements are so powerful, but they affect the individual, and they definitely transcend into a local election. So that's all I would have to add to that.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I'd like to follow up with the question, is emphasizing being a woman or woman of color, having these different types of experiences, a good campaign strategy?
So what's good is we have data on this, right? And I think everybody watched, in the 2016 election when Hillary Clinton was sort of kind of figuring out how to navigate being a woman explicitly, right, on the campaign trail. And I think different groups of women had different takeaways from her experience of not winning, right? I think there were definitely some groups of women who were like, okay, it does not work to put it front and center, but I think is a fairly obvious fact that you're a woman, and that's different from most people who are running for office, right? And I think other groups of women and other organizations took a totally different message away from that, right? Which is that, no, let's just be clear about my life experiences as a woman are different from the life experiences of a man running for the same office. And both of those things can be enriching and bring something to elected office. I think that what we saw in this last round, especially in the 2018 midterms and in the 2020 elections, was more women, I would say from both parties, talking about their experiences as Black women, as white women evangelicals, as women from certain communities, right, as rural women, immigrant women. I think we saw a lot more of that in the campaign messaging. And I tend to, from what I've seen in terms of the House results that I was talking about earlier, and in the state legislative races I follow, all of the political science studies of this show that it doesn't really make that big a difference in terms of negatively impacting women. And it might make a positive difference. It really depends on sort of how attentive to gender and race voters are to begin with. Some voters are very attentive to gender and race, and some aren't. And so it really depends on what kind of mix of voters you're targeting in terms of how that kind of messaging will really affect your support one way or another. I tend to be an advocate for people just being who they are. I think it's better for democracy. But I think that people really think very differently about what's strategic for the kind of district they're running in. And one of the organizations I work with really emphasizes that you should absolutely be your authentic self and also think about who you are running and who you are running to represent. And that those two things don't have to come into conflict, right?
That's great, thank you. I'll go ahead and read a question from the chat. This is from Melissa, and this question is to the both of you. Do you make efforts to avoid alienating men, especially white men, who sometimes feel marginalized and perhaps are driven toward Trump and similar candidates?
Do you want to start, Paola, or I can?
I'm not too sure how to answer that question. I think in terms of alienating people, I think it's just a matter of kind of figuring out like what the actual issues are, like what the policy issues are when it comes to running for office, and what issues affect the communities that are going to be represented by the candidate. I can't really, I mean, there've been a couple experiences where I was running or walking for an elected official, and they're nonpartisan, but there were questions of whether this person was a Republican or Democrat. And it's just one of those, like, those national issues trickling down to local politics. People don't understand or don't see those, how those two kind of don't relate in some ways. But yeah, I'm not too sure how to really pinpoint that, because I don't think it affects us too much. So
That's a tough question.
No, and I definitely have some thoughts about it, but I saw that Jamila also had a thought. Jamila, do you want to jump in and talk about this one?
Sure, I'd love to. I'll turn on my video too. I don't know if everyone
can see. Hi.
Yeah, I love this question. I think it's so important because it's like not wanting to go too far to the other side, I think, is a concern for some. But the way I would answer it is, I don't think that white men or any man is being marginalized. If Christians, Dr. Phillips' data showed anything, it showed just how small, white men in general are more front and center in politics and have been throughout the history. I think what we're experiencing now is that the balance of power. And when that happens, it can feel like, you're losing something when it starts to be more balanced. But I think being conscious of the data, so seeing things like this presentation really help. I think it helps people realize that there's strength in having different perspectives. It's not just like a nice thing to do. It's literally, you can track it from everything from genetics to business. Diverse opinions, rich, different backgrounds are just better. They're better, you make better decisions, make more money if you're a company. Companies that have more women at the top outperform those that don't. And so I think when men start to realize that it's intelligent, not just a nice thing to do, but that it's actually beneficial to everyone to have these different voices, diversity, then they stop feeling like they're people being encroached on their space and start to welcome these new voices and new faces that we all so much want to have. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Jamila. I really appreciate that. And I think that from my work and my research, I think that one of the things, Jamila really pinpointed this issue of when you have so much sort of institutional power in society. And that's not to say that all white men feel powerful all the time. Many don't, right? But when you are in a position where your race and your gender is not a key challenge or a key thing to navigate in your daily life, as it is for other groups, any sort of attention to other groups can feel like you're losing something, even though objectively you're not, right? And I think that attention to women and women speaking out and saying, and frankly, taking up space in American politics is a new experience, not only for white men, but I think it's a new experience for women too, right? And we are also, patriarchy is the ocean we all swim in. And, and I think that it's also something for all of us to adjust to as women, to see women speaking up and speaking out. And I think one of the things that happens sometimes, so I teach a class called Sex, Power, and Politics, and the syllabus is centered around women of color authors. And for my students, it's jarring not to have a syllabus, right? We're not even talking about elected office. We're not talking about who's on the city council, just to have a syllabus that's not dominated by white men. It's a new thing. They feel really uncomfortable with it. And to me, I think the more we have these conversations and talk about and raise the visibility of a really diverse and beautiful country full of very different experiences, the more people will become accustomed to it. But I don't, my personal feeling is that the journey that white men as individuals are on in terms of feeling alienated is something that, I want to appreciate and recognize, but I also want to make sure that the journey that women are on is something that we are lifting up and we are bringing more attention to, because as we showed in the data, right, that has not been recognized enough. And I think that's something that we can only build on for the future.
That's fantastic. Speaking of progress, is it too early to start thinking about 2022? What do you suggest can be done to get more women of color on the ballot? More women and women of color on the ballot, from Barbara.
Do you want to start, Paola, or you want me to?
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question, Barbara, because this is something I think that more people can be involved with than they might think, right? I think that everyone has a role to play in terms of if you are somebody who is, for instance, the USC alumni networks. I'm part of alumni networks from my alma maters. And every year we have amazing people who decide to run for office, or we all get together and we kind of talk about who, what's happening in local politics. And I think it is really important to sort of talk about the amazing women in your own networks and them as potential candidates, and ask them if there's an amazing woman who who you think has leadership capabilities. Why not ask her if she's thought about running for office? I think there is really something to sort of changing people's mindset about where they can put their leadership. And then I also think there is, I think there's something to be said for putting your money where your mouth is. We only have so much money in terms of donations of time and money for candidates. And I think it's really important to prioritize who you want to see reflected in office, right? And if you want to get more women of color elected to office, then I think it's a valuable thing to do to prioritize your giving of your time, your brilliance, and your money to candidates from those groups, if you really think that it's important that we expand those folks in office. I don't know if Paola, you had other things you wanted to add.
Yeah, I think it's never too early to start thinking about either encouraging your friend to run or deciding to run yourself. I think it is a matter of preparing and making sure you have everything aligned so that your campaign or whoever you're supporting can be successful in becoming an elected official. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of programs and training opportunities for women to get involved and to build on those skills. I think it's also important to definitely kind of start even thinking about your networks when deciding to run and deciding who you want to also support in running. So yeah, it's never too early. And I think we should be thinking about the next 2 years, the next 4 years, because it's a matter of building now so that we can accomplish what we see or what we want in the future.
And the one follow-up I'll say to Paola's brilliant comments is that there is no perfect time to run. I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of candidates. And let me tell you, there is no perfect time to run. The only perfect time is now. And no matter how much more qualified you think you need to be, or how many more training programs you think you need to go to, or how many more ex-mayors you need to meet, you know enough. You know more than the average candidate. I can just tell you that. And you're ready. If you're thinking about it, you're ready. There is no perfect time, so might as well just run now.
Oh, that's a great way to wrap this up. Thank you, Dr. Phillips. How inspiring. Well, now that we're at the top of the hour, I have just one last question, and that's on takeaways. What are some things that each of us can do, whether we're thinking about running or wanting to support other women and women of color? What are things that each one of us can do to implement these changes and this progress?
I'll start and do a shameless plug. Follow Latinas Lead California on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Our website is under construction, but it's going to be ready this January, I believe. So I think it's just about getting informed. Start following more women candidates on social media platforms. Get to know and understand where they stand and when their re-elections are coming up. That's really important, especially if you align with what they stand for and their policies so far. I think those would be my main takeaways, is just starting to follow people, get involved, ask questions, and really, like Dr. Phillips says, if you're thinking about it, just go for it and decide. And then decide and plan. I think it is essential to do that. So.
Yeah, I think that I would say, I think that just do one safe thing outside of the bubble you already exist in. I think one of the things that really concerns me about the pandemic, the pandemic, is that our opportunities to sort of expand who we're talking to, who we're thinking about not even just politics and getting elected, like that stuff really matters, right? But there's also who we're talking to about solving problems in our community, who we're talking to about getting playground equipment fixed in our neighborhoods, right? Those kinds of things. So to me, and I think that when we're all in our bubbles and pods and quarantines and stuff, it's really easy to sort of cut yourself off from being civically engaged and sort of expanding the world, getting to have your voice involved in it, right? So if I would recommend one thing, I would say just do one thing outside your regular bubble, right? You know, go to that online Zoom meeting of like a women's organization that you kind of heard about, but keep getting the emails for and ignoring, right? Just go to the Zoom happy hour, just try it. And maybe there will be an expansion in your own group of people that you are talking to and learning from. And I think that that really helps to expand all women's voices in civil society and in politics.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Phillips and Paola, sharing this information with us today. I think most of our attendees have taken that first step, right, in learning a little bit more and expanding that network. I'd now like to introduce, thank you. I'd now like to introduce Karen Carr-Crawford. Karen is chair of the Trojan Women's Network and will deliver our closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm here and gosh, I don't know what to say. You two were just phenomenal. You left us wanting more. An awesome presentation. Thank you, Dr. Phillips. Thank you, Paola. Just some very insightful remarks and takeaways. And I just love the comment, Paola, about following, a woman candidate and, Dr. Phillips getting outside of our bubble and really thinking differently about, kind of the community and the environment we live in and just, operating in a different space. And so I appreciate both of you for taking your time and joining us. And thanks to all of our participants tonight. I want to really thank you for coming and joining us. And you can stay connected to us. We do have a website and we've got Instagram page and all that wonderful stuff. So you can follow us on Trojan Women's Network. We're here on Facebook. We're on Facebook. Also stay connected to the USC Alumni Association. You can learn more through alumni.usc.edu. And we have a great holiday Trojan Women's Network event coming up Thursday, December 10th, 4:30. It's kind of a clean out your closet kind of thing and raise some funds, and you can learn more about it on our site. The fundraising actually benefits scholarships. So we look forward to having you participate. And I see the slide is up there, so we really would love to have you join us. Also want to kind of put out, a little ahead of time, the Women's Conference on March 5th and 6th with the theme being Thrive Together, and this certainly plays right into, the topics and the conversation around, women and empowering women to participate in the process of running for office and getting out. This certainly kind of connects there too. So we really want to encourage you to participate in the Women's Conference. And we're doing a lot in alignment with the Women's Conference this year. And finally, before you go, I want to ask you to consider supporting the Trojan Women's Network Scholarship Endowment. And you can find more by text, or you can text us. Just text TWN at 71777. Or you can visit giving.usc.edu. And on behalf of USC, the USC Alumni Association, I wish everyone a good evening. Thank you for attending. Have great holidays, and as always, fight on.